3 days had passed since the great marking ceremony, the night the stars seemed to dim in shame. Since Lucian, the man Seraphina had spent a lifetime following like a shadow, shoved her into the dirt before the entire Black Owl pack and branded her unwanted, as if she were nothing more than a broken toy. The memory of his sneer was a phantom ache in her chest, sharper than the cold mud that had seeped into her dress that night. Now, standing on the edge of the village square, the echoes of the pack's mocking laughter felt like shards of ice against her skin. The air was thick with the scent of pine and impending snow, but the atmosphere was suffocating. Every eye was a needle, every whisper a lash. Lucian stood on the raised dais, his arm draped possessively around a high-born female from a neighboring territory, his gaze studiously avoiding the woman he had discarded like common refuse. Seraphina lowered her head, her fingers trembling as she clutched a tattered shawl. She was prepared for the final blow, the formal decree of her exile. Suddenly the temperature didn't just drop, it plummeted. The jeers died in 100 throats, replaced by a silence so absolute it was deafening. The heavy rhythmic thud of boots against stone heralded a presence that demanded the very air as its tribute. Kalen Blackowl, the Alpha King, a man whose name was a prayer to some and a curse to others, stepped from the shadows of the high keep. He was a mountain of fur and scarred leather, his eyes burning with the cold fire of a winter moon. He didn't look at his brother and he didn't look at the council. His focus was a singular, terrifying beam locked onto Seraphina. As he approached, the crowd parted like a sea before a storm. Seraphina braced herself, expecting the king to finish what his brother had started, to sweep the unwanted girl from his sight forever. Instead, the king stopped. The towering, bearded shadow loomed over her, blocking out the sun. To the collective gasp of the Black Owl pack, the Alpha King did not point toward the gates. He reached down, his massive hands surprisingly gentle as he hooked a finger under Seraphina's chin, forcing her to meet his gaze. "You call this woman unmarked?" Kalen's voice rolled across the square like low thunder, vibrating in Seraphina's very marrow. He turned his head slightly, his eyes flashing with a predatory silver as they locked onto a trembling Lucian. "You call her unwanted? Then you are more than a traitor, brother. You are a fool." Before a single breath could be drawn, Kalen pulled her toward him. The heat radiating from his body was a revelation. With a deliberate possessive motion, he bared his teeth and pressed his mark against her shoulder. A shockwave of pure, golden light erupted from the contact, forced by a bond so ancient the earth itself seemed to groan in recognition. "She is no longer of your rank," Kalen roared, his voice echoing off the mountain peaks. "She is the moon's choice. She is your queen." Chapter 1. The great marking ceremony was supposed to be the dawn of Seraphina Vale's life. Instead, it became its funeral. The air in the sacred grove was thick with the scent of damp earth and the heavy musky musk of hundreds of wolves, all gathered to witness the union of the Alpha's line. Seraphina stood in the center of the circle, her white dress stained at the hem, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had spent a decade in Lucian's shadow, the quiet, loyal betrothed who took his moods and his negligence in exchange for the promise of a home. But as Lucian stepped into the moonlight, his face wasn't filled with the solemnity of the ritual. It was twisted into a mask of cruel liberation. He didn't reach for her hand. He reached for her spirit, intent on crushing it. "Look at her," Lucian's voice boomed, amplified by the natural stone amphitheater of the woods. He circled her like a predator, his eyes flashing with a shallow, arrogant amber. 10 years I have been shackled to this shadow. A woman who cannot even summon a flicker of the pack's fire. A woman who is wolfless in all but name. The first snicker broke the silence, a jagged sound from the back of the crowd. It spread like an infection. Seraphina looked out at the faces she had known since childhood, people she had baked bread for, mended clothes for, bled for during the winter raids. They weren't looking at a friend. They were looking at a joke that had finally reached its punchline. "I, Lucian Blackowl, heir to the Alpha's blood, find this offering insufficient," he sneered. He stepped into her personal space, his breath hot against her ear as he whispered, "Did you really think I'd settle for a pebble when I could have a diamond?" Then with a violent shove that sent her sprawling into the dirt, he shouted to the heavens, "I reject this weakling. Let her remain unmarked, unloved, and unwanted. Clear her from my sight." The humiliation was a physical weight, heavier than the iron collar he had refused to place on her neck. Serafina lay in the mud, the rough stones scraping her palms, as the pack erupted into full, howling laughter. The sound was a gale-force wind of mockery. She looked up, her vision blurred by tears she refused to let fall, and saw Lucian already turning away, pulling a laughing, gold-clad woman into his arms, the high-born mate he had secretly chosen to replace her. Serafina gathered her strength to crawl away, to find the dark safety of the treeline and never look back. But as she pushed herself up, the world suddenly went cold. It wasn't the chill of a passing breeze. It was the absolute soul-deep frost of a winter god's arrival. The laughter didn't just fade, it was choked out. A heavy rhythmic thud began to vibrate through the earth, a sound like the heartbeat of the mountain itself. One by one, the wolves of the Black Howl pack fell to their knees, their heads bowing in a reflexive, primal terror. Kalen Black Howl, the Alpha King, had descended from his throne. He moved with a lethal, predatory grace that made his brother Lucian look like a posturing child. Towering and broad-shouldered, draped in the heavy furs of a prehistoric beast, Kalen's presence felt like a thunderstorm held behind a dam. His beard was dark as a starless night, and his eyes, cold, piercing silver, were fixed solely on the girl in the dirt. Lucian's arrogance vanished, replaced by a frantic, pale-faced confusion. "Brother, this is a private matter of my court. The girl is nothing. She is unwanted." Kalen didn't even look at him. He stopped inches from Serafina, his shadow swallowing her whole. The silence was so thick it felt like it could shatter. Then the king did the unthinkable. He didn't order her exile. He reached down, his massive calloused hand cupping her face with a tenderness that felt like a silent scream. "You call her unwanted?" Kalen's voice wasn't a shout. It was a low, resonant growl that shook the very trees. "Then you have blinded yourself to the moon's own light." Before Serafina could gasp, Kalen pulled her upward, his strength effortless. He bared his neck to the sky, then turned his gaze back to her, his silver eyes burning with a sudden, fierce hunger. With a deliberate, possessive motion, he leaned down and pressed his mark against her shoulder. A shock wave of pure, blinding white light erupted from the contact, a force so powerful it knocked the standing elders back. It wasn't just a mark, it was a reclamation. The ancient bond, the fated mate tether, snapped into place with a roar that echoed across the kingdom. Kalen pulled back, his hand remaining firmly on the nape of her neck as he faced his horrified pack. "She is no longer the rejected," he declared, his voice a decree of fate. "She's my mate. She's your queen. And anyone who dares laugh at her again will answer to my claws." The silence returned, but this time, it was the silence of a pack that realized they had just mocked a goddess. Serafina stood beside the king, the heat of his body acting as a shield against the world, her heart no longer a trapped bird but a rising sun. Chapter 2. The transition from the mud of the ritual grounds to the obsidian halls of the High Keep felt less like a journey and more like a fever dream. Serafina walked in the wake of the Alpha King, her shoulder burning where his mark had seared into her skin, a brand of fire that refused to cool. The fortress loomed ahead, a jagged crown of iron and ice perched atop the highest peak of the Black Howl Range. It was a place of legends and nightmares, a monolith where the air grew thin and the silence grew heavy. As the massive iron-bound doors groaned open, the guards fell to their knees. Their armor clattered against the stone, a rhythmic metallic prayer to the man who walked before her. Kalen did not acknowledge them. He did not look back to see if Serafina was following. He simply moved with a terrifying certainty that she would. His cloak of heavy furs trailed behind him like a storm cloud, and for a moment Serafina felt small, a moth caught in the slipstream of an apex predator. The interior of the High Keep was a labyrinth of cold grandeur. Pillars of raw stone supported ceilings that vanished into shadow, and the walls were draped with tapestries depicting ancient wars and celestial alignments. Every step Serafina took echoed, a lonely sound that reminded her she was an intruder in this sanctuary of power. Kalen finally halted in a wide, circular hall illuminated by a central hearth that roared with blue-tinged flames. He turned then, his silhouette framed by the fire. His face remained a mask of granite, his silver eyes unreadable. "This is your home now," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. "The pack will not touch you. My brother will not look at you. You are under the shadow of the king." Why? The word escaped her before she could find her courage. She clutched the tattered shawl around her shoulders, her fingers brushing the edge of the dress Lucian had ruined. I am wolfless, Kaelin. I am the girl they laughed at. Why would a king claim a pariah? Kaelin's expression didn't soften, but something shifted in his gaze. A flicker of an emotion so old and deep it looked like pain. The pack sees what it is told to see. I see what is true. He gestured toward a winding staircase to the left. Your chambers are above. Rest. The transition of the bond is taxing. He left her then, disappearing into the darker recesses of the fortress without another word. His coldness was a physical wall, yet it lacked the jagged cruelty she had known with Lucian. It was the coldness of deep water, vast, silent, and containing depths she couldn't fathom. Sleep did not come. The bond in her shoulder pulsed in time with the fortress's own heartbeat. Driven by a restlessness she couldn't explain, Seraphina slipped from her room as the moon reached its zenith. She wandered the corridors, her bare feet silent on the cold stone, drawn by a strange magnetic pull toward a wing of the keep that felt older than the rest. At the end of a narrow gallery she found a door of dark rowan wood, unmarked and unassuming. It wasn't locked. It yielded to her touch with a soft sigh. Seraphina stepped inside and froze. This was not a storehouse or a library of state secrets. It was a sanctuary. Sunlight, no moonlight, was magically channeled through a crystal skylight, illuminating a room filled with objects that made her breath hitch. Against the far wall stood a workbench, and on it sat a wooden carving of a small, lopsided wolf. It was the first thing she had ever carved as a child, a toy she had lost in the woods 15 years ago. Next to it was a ribbon she had worn to her first harvest dance, a pressed wildflower from the summer she turned 16, and a collection of sketches. She moved toward the sketches, her heart thundering. They were portraits of her. Not as the unwanted girl in the mud, but as she appeared when she thought no one was looking. There she was, laughing at the creek. There she was, tending to a wounded pup. There she was, looking up at the stars with a longing she thought she had hidden from the world. The dates on the margins went back years. I found the carving near the northern ridge, a voice said from the doorway. Seraphina spun around. Kaelin stood there, his massive frame nearly filling the entrance. He looked out of place in this room of delicate memories, a titan among ghosts. He didn't look angry that she had found it. He looked exposed. You've been watching me, she whispered, the realization crashing over her. All those years I was with Lucian, believing I was invisible. You were there. Kaelin stepped into the moonlight, and for the first time, the ice in his eyes thawed into something raw and burning. My brother saw a shadow to be walked upon. I saw the lunar heart waiting to wake. I waited for him to realize your worth, Seraphina. I waited for him to be the man you deserved. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper. But he failed. And I realized that if I did not claim you, the world would break you before you knew who you were. Seraphina looked back at the sketches, then at the king who had built a temple to her existence while she was being mocked by his people. The intimidation she felt wasn't gone, but it had transformed. She wasn't just a queen by decree. She was a woman who had been seen, truly seen, long before the crown ever touched her head. Chapter 3. The air in the lower village tasted of ash and bitter resentment. Lucian Blackhowl sat in the dim corner of the Pack Central Tavern, his fingers white-knuckled around a flagon of ale he hadn't touched. Outside, the world had changed. The atmosphere of the Blackhowl Pack, once defined by the boisterous, cruel hierarchy he had mastered, had shifted into something hushed and reverent. Every time the heavy gates of the high keep groaned open, the villagers stopped. They didn't stop to mock or throw stones as they once had when Seraphina walked among them. They stopped to bow. They whispered of the Lunar Queen, of the way the frost seemed to melt beneath her feet, and of the terrifying protective aura the Alpha King radiated whenever she was near. Lucian's jaw tightened until it ached. Across the table, Ilara, the highborn mate he had chosen for her political leverage and sharp tongue, was complaining about the lack of silk imports, but her voice was merely background noise to the roar of blood in his ears. He couldn't stop seeing it, the way Kaelin's massive hand had cupped Seraphina's face. The way the light had exploded from her skin, a celestial fire that had never once flickered during the 10 years she had spent at Lucian's side. She was nothing, Lucian hissed, the words slipping out like venom. What was that, darling? Elara asked, her eyes narrowing. Seraphina, he spat, finally looking at his new mate. She was a wolfless shadow. A stray I kept fed out of pity. How is she standing on a balcony over us? How is she wearing the black hull diamonds? Elara sneered, her vanity pricked. She's a parlor trick, Lucian. Your brother is making a point about his power by elevating a peasant. It's a political move, nothing more. Forget her. But Lucian couldn't forget. Regret is a slow-acting poison, and he had been drinking it by the gallon for 3 days. It wasn't love that burned in his gut. He didn't know how to love something he couldn't own. It was the pure, agonizing sting of a blow to his ego. He had thrown away a stone only to realize it was the foundation of the kingdom. He felt like a fool, and in the Black Hull Pack a fool was a dead man. He stood abruptly, leaving Elara mid-sentence, and walked out into the cold night air. He looked up at the high keep, the iron fortress silhouetted against the bloated, silver moon. Somewhere up there she was sleeping in silk. She was being touched by a king. The obsession took root then, a dark, thorny vine wrapping around his heart. He began to convince himself that Kaelin hadn't found a mate. He had stolen a prize. He convinced himself that the light he had seen was a dormant power he had cultivated through his generosity over the years. Seraphina wasn't a queen. She was his property, temporarily misplaced in his brother's vault. He thinks he can take what is mine? Lucian whispered to the shadows of the alleyway. He thinks he can humiliate me before my own people? He reached into his tunic, feeling the cold metal of a seal he had stolen from his father's old study. A seal that belonged to the Ebon-Claw, a rogue sect of shadow wolves who lived in the Forbidden Wastes. They had been looking for a way into the High Keep for decades. They wanted Kaelin's head, and now Lucian wanted his woman back. If he couldn't have her as his subordinate, he would take her as a trophy of war. He would tear down the keep stone by stone if he had to, just to see the Lunar Queen back in the dirt where he believed she belonged. The plan began to knit itself together in the darkness of his mind. A betrayal of blood, a pact with the shadows, and a desperate, violent grab for the woman he had been too stupid to keep. Chapter 4. The air inside the high keep grew thick and electric as the moon reached its zenith. A heavy silver coin pressed against the velvet throat of the sky. For Seraphina, the night was no longer a time for sleep. It was a visceral, pulsing pressure in her marrow. Since Kaelin had marked her, her body felt like a vessel being filled with liquid moonlight, straining against the seams of her skin. She paced the length of her stone balcony, her breath blooming in white plumes, until the sensation became an unbearable roar. She collapsed to her knees as the first wave of the change hit. This was not the bone-snapping agony she had heard the other wolves describe, the horrific cracking of ribs and the tearing of sinew that marked a first shift. Instead, it felt like a homecoming of the soul. A searing heat flooded her veins, and for a moment, the world blurred into a spectrum of silver and violet. Her skin didn't tear. It shimmered, dissolving into a coat of fur as white as a mountain peak at dawn. When she opened her eyes, she was no longer looking through the limited vision of a girl. Her senses exploded. She could hear the snow settling on the distant ridges. She could smell the ancient iron of the castle's foundations. She was a creature of myth, a wolf of pure starlight, but she was no longer on the balcony. She stood in a realm of mist and ancient trees, a forest that existed in the spaces between heartbeats. Before her, a row of towering ethereal figures materialized, the ancestors of the Black Hull Pack, their eyes glowing with the wisdom of 1,000 winters. They did not growl, they bowed. The lunar heart has finally stopped beating in the dark, the eldest spirit whispered, his voice like the rustle of dry leaves. Seraphina tried to speak, but her thoughts translated into a resonance that shook the mist. What am I? You are the bridge, the spirit replied, his translucent form flickering. The wolves of this world have grown cold and cruel, forgetting the goddess who gave them their teeth. You are the spark that returns the fire. But the fire attracts the shadow. The vision shifted violently. The peaceful grove was swallowed by a creeping oily darkness that smelled of rot and old grudges. In the center of the gloom she saw a familiar silhouette, Lucian. But he wasn't alone. He was surrounded by eyes of sickly yellow, the eyes of the Ebon-Claw, the rogue sect that lived in the world's wounds. Beware the wolf who shares the king's blood, the ancestors warned in a chorus that sounded like a funeral knell. The rejection was not the end of your trial, but the beginning of his descent. There is a traitor in the bloodline, one who would see the moon eclipse to satisfy his own pride. If the lunar heart stops beating, the pack will fall into a night that has no dawn. The darkness surged forward, cold and suffocating, and Serafina let out a howl that wasn't a cry of fear but a call to war. She snapped back to reality on the balcony floor, her human hands clutching the cold stone, gasping for air. The fur was gone, the spirits had vanished, but the warning remained etched into her mind like a brand. She looked toward the door just as it swung open, Kalen standing there with a torch in his hand, his eyes wide with a rare, naked alarm. He had heard her howl, the howl of a queen who had seen the end of the world. Chapter 5. The training courtyard was a desolate expanse of gray stone, tucked away in a corner of the high keep where the wind whistled through the battlements like a dying man's breath. The morning air was sharp enough to sting the lungs, and the sky held the bruised, heavy hue of a coming storm. Serafina stood in the center of the ring, her hands gripping the hilt of a practice blade. The weapon felt heavy, an alien extension of her arm that seemed to mock her history as a girl who had only ever held sewing needles and wooden spoons. Kalen stood opposite her, stripped of his heavy furs and ceremonial armor. In a simple tunic of dark leather, his physical presence was even more overwhelming. He was a landscape of hard lines and ancient scars, a man built by a lifetime of violence and duty. He didn't hold a sword. He simply watched her, his silver eyes tracking the slight tremor in her wrists. "A weapon is not a tool of the hand, Serafina," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to ground her. "It is a conduit for the soul. If you fear the steel will betray you." "I don't fear the steel," she countered, though her voice lacked the conviction she craved. "I fear what I am becoming. The things I saw in the shift. The ancestors." "Then use that fear," Kalen commanded, stepping forward. He moved with a grace that was deceptively slow, yet before she could react, his hand was on her shoulder, adjusting her stance. His touch was electric, a searing heat that traveled through the layers of her tunic and ignited the bond between them. The lunar heart is not just a title of peace. It is a title of protection. If you cannot defend your own life, you cannot defend the pack. The hours that followed were a grueling dance of failure and frustration. Kalen was a relentless teacher, pushing her until her muscles screamed and sweat turned to ice on her skin. Again and again he disarmed her with a flick of his wrist, her sword clattering across the stones. He didn't offer empty encouragement or soft words. He offered only the cold, hard truth of combat. By midday, Serafina's frustration boiled over. As Kalen swept her legs out from under her for the 10th time, she didn't just fall, she surged. A spark of that silver fire she had felt during the shift ignited in her gut. She rolled, coming up with a snarl that wasn't entirely human, and swung the practice blade with a desperate, lunging force. Kalen didn't move to disarm her this time. He caught the wooden blade in his bare hand, the impact making a dull thud. He looked down at her, his eyes wide, seeing the flickering light behind her pupils. The tension between them snapped, transforming from the heat of battle into something far more dangerous. Serafina let go of the sword, her chest heaving, her face inches from his. "Is that what you want?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of rage and exhaustion. "To turn me into a monster like the rest of this pack?" Kalen's grip on her arm tightened, but not in malice. He pulled her flush against him, his heartbeat a frantic, heavy rhythm against her own. The mask of the Alpha King, the granite, the ice, the unshakable iron, cracked. In the proximity, Serafina saw the lines of weariness around his eyes and the profound loneliness he carried as a shield. "I don't want a monster," Kalen rasped, his breath hot against her forehead. "I want the only person who ever looked at me and didn't see a throne or a weapon. I want you, Serafina. Not because of the moon and not because of the bond." He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a vulnerability that broke her heart. In that moment the king was gone, leaving only a man who had been a ghost in his own life until she arrived. When he finally leaned down and pressed his lips to hers, it wasn't a claim of power. It was a surrender. The icy walls of the high keep seemed to melt away, leaving them alone in the center of a storm, two fractured souls finally finding their anchor. Chapter 6. The great hall was a cathedral of light and sound, but to Serafina, it felt like a gilded cage. To celebrate the new union and settle the unrest rippling through the territories, Kaelin had ordered a diplomatic feast. Hundreds of candles flickered in the drafty heights, casting long, dancing shadows against the tapestries of ancient victories. The scent of roasted venison and spiced wine filled the air, warring with the underlying smell of wet fur and the sharp metallic tang of tension. Seraphina sat beside Kaelin on the high dais, draped in silks the color of a winter twilight. She could feel the eyes of the lesser alphas and their mates drilling into her, some filled with newfound awe, others with a simmering bitter resentment. Kaelin sat like a statue of obsidian, his hand resting possessively over hers on the table. His touch was the only thing keeping her grounded as the lunar heart within her chest began to thrum with a rhythmic, unsettling anxiety. Across the hall, near the lower tables meant for the extended bloodline, sat Lucian. He looked different tonight. The arrogance that usually defined his posture had been replaced by a haunting, hollow-eyed stillness. He didn't join in the boisterous toasts. He simply watched them, his gaze flickering between Kaelin and Seraphina like a dying ember. As the feast reached its height, Lucian stood, a silver chalice held high. "A toast," he called out, his voice cutting through the din with a forced oily cheer. "To my brother the king for his wisdom in strengthening our pack's future. And his queen." The pack roared its approval, the sound bouncing off the stone walls. A servant, dressed in the black howl livery, approached the dais with a fresh decanter of the king's private reserve. Seraphina watched the liquid pour into Kaelin's cup, a deep, dark crimson that looked uncomfortably like blood. Suddenly the world slowed. The lunar heart in Seraphina's chest didn't just beat, it screamed. A cold, oily sensation crawled up her spine, a sensory warning that had nothing to do with sight or sound. She looked at the wine in Kaelin's hand and for a split second her vision shifted. The wine wasn't just red, it was pulsing with a sickly violet heartbeat. She could smell it now, not the grapes or the spice, but the bitter chemical stench of nightshade root, a toxin designed to paralyze a wolf's heart within seconds. Her eyes flew to Lucian. He was leaning forward, his knuckles white against the table, a predatory hunger in his eyes that he couldn't hide. Kaelin raised the chalice to his lips, his gaze fixed on his brother in a silent challenge of brotherhood. "Kaelin, no." The scream tore from Seraphina's throat just as the rim of the cup touched his teeth. She lunged across the table, her hand striking the silver chalice with a frantic strength fueled by pure instinct. The cup flew from his hand, spinning through the air and splashing the dark, poisoned wine across the white linen cloth. The hall fell into a terrifying, suffocating silence. Kaelin sat frozen, a single drop of the liquid clinging to his lower lip. Seraphina stood over him, her chest heaving, her eyes glowing with a fierce, celestial silver that illuminated the entire dais. "The wine," she gasped, her finger trembling as she pointed at the purple stain now eating into the fabric like acid. "It's poisoned." Before Kaelin could react, the servant who had poured the wine bolted toward the side exit. But the Alpha King was faster. With a roar of primal fury, Kaelin vaulted over the table, his form blurring as he shifted midair into a massive shadow-furred beast. He pinned the traitor against the stone wall before the man could reach the shadows. Lucian stood amidst the chaos, his face a mask of feigned horror, but Seraphina didn't look at the servant. She locked eyes with the brother who had discarded her, seeing the rot behind his beautiful face. The peace was gone. The unwanted girl had saved the king, but in doing so she had signaled the start of a war that would leave no stone unturned. Chapter 7. The aftermath of the feast was not a celebration of life saved, but a grim herald of the carnage to come. Lucian had vanished into the night before the king's claws could find his throat, leaving behind a trail of silver-tongued lies and a scent of desperation that lingered in the great hall like rot. He did not flee to the wilderness to hide. He fled to the one place even the most hardened Black Howl warriors feared, the sunless wastes, the jagged territory of the Ebon-Claw. Seraphina stood on the highest rampart of the keep, watching the northern horizon. The bond in her chest was no longer a warm hum. It was a jagged, frantic rhythm. Beside her, Kaelin was a silhouette of brooding iron, his presence radiating a cold fury that seemed to beckon the very clouds. He had not spoken for hours, his mind locked in the tactical silence of a commander who knew his own blood had turned against him. "He won't stop," Seraphina whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising wind. "The rejection, it didn't break him, Kaelin. It freed the monster he was already hiding. "He was always a shadow," Kalen replied, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. "I simply hoped he was a shadow that belonged to the light. Now he has given himself to the Ebon-Claw. They don't want a pack, Seraphina. They want a graveyard." As if summoned by his words, the sky began to transform. It wasn't the natural descent of a winter storm. A thick, unnatural fog as black as ink and smelling of ozone and ancient malice began to roll down from the peaks. The snow that fell was not white, but a bruised, ashen gray, swirling in patterns that defied the wind. It was a magical tempest, a veil woven by the Ebon-Claw's dark shamans to blind the High Keep and stifle the instincts of its protectors. Down in the valley the first screams began. The invasion didn't come with the thunder of hooves, but with the silence of ghosts. Under the cover of the unnatural blizzard, the Ebon-Claw warriors, wolves whose fur was matted with dried blood and whose eyes burned with forbidden sorcery, scaled the outer walls. Leading them was a figure draped in a cloak of shadow, his golden hair the only thing that remained of the man Seraphina had once thought she loved. Lucian rode at the head of the nightmare, his face twisted into a mask of terrifying, ecstatic rage. "Seal the gates." Kalen's roar broke the spell of the storm. He shifted in a blur of fur and muscle, his massive shadow wolf form towering over the ramparts. "To the battlements. Protect the lunar heart." But the storm was more than a distraction. It was a weapon. Every flake of ashen snow that touched a Black Howl warrior seemed to sap their strength, dragging them into a lethargy of the soul. Seraphina felt the pull of the darkness, a cold hand reaching for the light in her chest. She saw Lucian reach the inner courtyard, his sword wreathed in black flame. He looked up, his eyes locking onto hers through the swirling chaos, a silent promise of reclamation written in his sneer. The Shadow Pack had risen, fueled by the envy of a brother and the hunger of an ancient enemy. As the iron doors of the keep groaned under the first assault, Seraphina realized the vision of the ancestors was no longer a warning, it was the reality they were drowning in. The battle for the High Keep had begun and the snow was already turning red. Chapter 8. The iron gates of the High Keep didn't just break. They disintegrated under the weight of the Ebon-Claw's sorcery. The air in the courtyard was a vortex of ashen snow and black fire, a chaotic theater where the living fought the damned. Kalen and Seraphina stood at the center of the storm, a binary star of shadow and light. Kalen, in his massive wolf form, was a hurricane of claws and teeth, a mountain of dark fur protecting the woman at his back. Beside him, Seraphina fought with a lethal elegance that defied her weeks of training, her practice blade replaced by a shimmering steel rapier that seemed to hum in tune with her heartbeat. They fought as one soul in two bodies. Every time an Ebon-Claw assassin lunged from the magical fog, Kalen was there to intercept, his snarl a physical shockwave. And every time a shadow wolf tried to flank the king's blind side, Seraphina's blade found its mark, guided by a silver intuition that told her where the enemy was before they even manifested. But the sheer number of the invaders was a rising tide, and the magical snow continued to sap the strength of the Black Howl loyalists. "Kalen, behind you!" Seraphina screamed, her voice cutting through the roar of battle. Lucian emerged from the mist, but he was no longer the man she had known. His skin was unnaturally pale, etched with glowing violet veins that pulsed with the forbidden magic of the Shadow Pack. He held an ancient, obsidian spear, its tip dripping with a liquid darkness that seemed to swallow the light of the torches. He didn't aim for Seraphina, he aimed for the king's heart. With a shriek of unnatural power, Lucian hurled the spear. Kalen turned to strike it down, but the weapon didn't behave like steel. It dissolved into a swarm of shadow leeches mid-air, bypassing his guard and sinking into his chest. The Alpha King let out a sound that was less a howl and more a death rattle. He collapsed, his massive form flickering as he was forced back into his human shape, coughing up black bile. The dark magic began to spread across his skin like a web of frost, paralyzing his muscles and dimming the silver fire in his eyes. "The king is fallen." Lucian's voice rang out, triumphant and jagged with madness. "Claim the girl. Burn the rest." Lucian stepped over his brother's prone body, his hand reaching for Seraphina's throat, his face twisted in a predatory grin of reclamation. "I told you, Seraphina. You are my property. You were always meant to kneel to me." As Lucian's fingers grazed her skin, the lunar heart within Seraphina didn't just pulse. It detonated. The grief of seeing Kaelin fall, combined with the sheer revulsion of Lucian's touch, shattered the final dam holding back her power. A pillar of pure, celestial moonlight erupted from her chest, tearing through the roof of the high keep and piercing the black clouds above. The unnatural snowstorm was vaporized instantly. Seraphina rose into the air, her hair flowing like a river of silver, her eyes becoming two twin moons that bled radiance. This was not the light of a candle. It was the blinding, holy fire of the moon goddess herself. The shadow wolves screamed as the light touched them, their bodies dissolving into smoke as the purity of the lunar heart burned the corruption from the air. Lucian was thrown back, blinded and wailing, his obsidian spear turning to ash in his hands. The entire courtyard was bathed in a white brilliance so intense that the invaders couldn't even raise their paws to fight. They were left naked and defenseless before the woman they had once mocked. Seraphina landed softly beside Kaelin, the light around her forming a protective halo that drove the poison from his veins. She looked out at the remnants of the Ebon-Claw and her traitorous former lover, her voice echoing with the authority of the ancestors. "I am the lunar heart," she proclaimed, the sound resonating in the marrow of every wolf present. "I am the light that guards the night. And this kingdom will never belong to a shadow." The invaders who survived fled into the woods, their eyes burned, their spirits broken. The Black Howl warriors, recovering their strength as the darkness lifted, looked up at Seraphina with a terror that rapidly transformed into a profound, soul-deep reverence. They didn't just see a queen, they saw their salvation. Chapter 9. The sun rose over the Black Howl range not as a weak winter orb, but as a golden herald, reflecting off the fresh, untainted snow that now covered the scars of the night's carnage. The unnatural ashen blizzard had vanished, purged by the celestial fire of the lunar heart, leaving the air crisp and smelling of ozone and pine. Smoke still curled from the scorched battlements of the high keep, but the silence that hung over the courtyard was no longer the silence of fear. It was the heavy, pregnant stillness of a world that had been fundamentally rewritten. In the center of the courtyard, the remnants of the Ebon-Claw lay in chains, their dark magic stripped away by the dawn. But all eyes were fixed on the two figures standing atop the shattered dais. Kaelin Blackhowl stood tall, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, his pale skin bearing the faint silvery traceries of the dark magic he had survived, scars that would forever mark him as a king who had walked through the abyss. Beside him stood Seraphina. She no longer wore the tattered shawl of a pariah or the borrowed silks of a guest. She stood draped in a mantle of pure white wolf fur, her eyes retaining a faint ethereal shimmer that reminded everyone present of the goddess she carried within her. At their feet, Lucian was dragged forward by two elite guards. The man who had once been the golden prince of the pack was a hollowed-out wreck. The violet veins of the shadow pack had faded, leaving his skin sallow and his eyes bloodshot. He looked at Seraphina and for the first time, there was no arrogance, no lust for property and no mockery. There was only the shattering realization of what he had truly thrown away. "You had 1,000 chances to be a man of honor, Lucian," Kaelin's voice rang out, no longer a roar of anger but a cold, final judgment. "You chose the shadow. You chose to strike at the heart of your own blood." Lucian tried to speak but his voice was a broken rasp. He looked to the pack, the people who had once cheered for his cruelty, and found only turned backs and bared teeth. The laughter that had defined Seraphina's life was gone, replaced by a collective loathing for the man who had almost led them to extinction. "I will not spill your blood upon this soil," Kaelin declared, his gaze hardening. "That would be a mercy the earth does not owe you. You are stripped of your name, your rank and your wolf. You are exiled to the sunless wastes. If you survive the first moon, let it be as a ghost who remembers that he once had a queen, and he was too small to deserve her." As the guards dragged a wailing Lucian toward the iron gates, destined for a wasteland where the sun never warmed the stone, a shift began to move through the gathered wolves. It started with the elders, the ones who had remained silent during the great marking ceremony, and then spread to the young warriors who had once snickered at the wolfless girl. One by one they dropped. The sound of hundreds of knees hitting the stone was a rhythmic thunder. Head after head bowed low, until the entire Black Howl pack was prostrate before the dais. This was not the forced submission of a conquered people. It was a genuine soul-deep reverence for the woman who had stood in the breach and held back the night. Kalen turned to Serafina, his fierce silver eyes softening with a love that was no longer a secret kept in a locked room. He took her hand and raised it toward the morning sky. "Behold your queen," he cried. The response was a howl that shook the mountains, a song of loyalty and rebirth that echoed from the highest peaks to the deepest valleys. Serafina looked out at the sea of bowed heads, feeling the lunar heart within her beat in perfect synchronicity with the pack. The girl they had laughed at was gone, burned away in the fire of her own awakening. In her place stood a sovereign of light, and as the new dawn broke over the high keep, she knew that for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she was meant to be.